I was out riding with a buddy of mine, exploring the Sierra foothills outside of Lodi, California. He had stumbled upon this inconspicuous road on the map, one of those unmarked gray routes that usually signify a county road or forest access path. Easy to miss. Around a mile up the road, we passed a sign that caught our attention. Maintained by PG&E and no road markings. The pavement was still intact, but the signs were the only indicators that this was anything other than a deserted back road. There were no driveways, no mailboxes, just asphalt winding its way up the ridgeline. I started to feel confident, taking the turns with gusto, getting into the rhythm of the winding road. It was just the kind of adventure I relished. Then, I reached the top of the ridge, and the unthinkable happened. I seemingly lost the road. No, really. It looked like the road just ended right in front of me. In a heartbeat, I slammed on the brakes, and the rear tire began to skid as I hit the gravel. The bike came to a stop with the front tire practically in the grass, overlooking a pasture with a menacing barbed wire fence a mere 10 feet away. I surveyed my surroundings. To the left, there appeared to be a ranch driveway with 2 sets of sandy tracks and grass in between. To the right, well, I looked further to the right. As it turned out, the road didn't terminate. It took a blind, hairpin turn to the right, an almost 65-degree curve right at the ridge's summit. If I hadn't practiced emergency braking, I'd have undoubtedly plowed right through that barbed wire fence. In that scenario, my riding buddy would have found himself calling for a life flight helicopter to retrieve me. After that heart-stopping moment, we opted for a more cautious pace the rest of the way to Lake Tahoe, and all the way back home. The moral of this tale: when the road starts to enchant and seduce you, snap out of it. Keep your wits and judgment at 100% all the time. If you ever find yourself succumbing to the song of the sausage creature, it's high time to dial it back and prioritize safety over speed. The other night, I was heading home on one of those winding, rugged roads here in West Virginia. It was a moonless night, with thick overcast skies, making it nearly pitch black. There was a car trailing about half a mile behind me in my rearview mirror. I crested a hill and began descending into a sweeping curve that eventually led to a narrow bridge. This bridge was perched over a steep drop-off on both sides, adding an extra layer of tension to the situation. Just as I started my descent down the hill, it happened. Everything shut off. My headlight, running light, brake light, engine, everything. It was as if my world had gone completely dark in an instant. My brain scrambled, attempting to process this abrupt sensory deprivation. I couldn't see the road, the shoulder, or anything else for that matter. Panic set in as I struggled to maintain some semblance of control. I clenched the handlebars, trying to stay on what I hoped was the center of the road. It was a terrifying few moments as I navigated this dark abyss. Miraculously, I managed to stay centered on the road. As I reached the bottom of the hill, my eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness, and I could barely make out the guardrail. I coasted over and stopped on the narrow strip of road sandwiched between the lane and the bridge's edge. Then, out of nowhere, a car came roaring over the hill at what seemed like 70 miles an hour, passing me with what felt like mere inches to spare. It was evident that the driver was not in their best state of mind, possibly intoxicated. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, fumbling in the pitch-black darkness with my motorcycle, shivering in the cold, all the while hoping no one would inadvertently turn me into a human speed bump. Then, as suddenly as everything had gone dark, it all came back to life. The lights flickered back on, and I could hear the familiar hum of the fuel pump. I couldn't help but wonder if, just maybe, the Mothman himself had decided to play a little trick on me that night. Being rendered blind on a motorcycle is a terrifying experience, one I won't soon forget. Certainly, touring on bicycles can be an adventure, and sometimes you meet folks who leave a lasting impression. Our tour began with a stop in Jacksonville, NC, where we decided to visit a local bike shop to get a lay of the land. Inside the shop, there were about half a dozen people just hanging around. I walked in with enthusiasm, introducing ourselves and explaining that we were embarking on our first tour, starting from the South Carolina border and heading up to New York. To be honest, it seemed like our plans didn't interest anyone in the shop much, and that was perfectly fine. I asked if anyone knew of a good camping spot in the area, and it was as if I had asked the most peculiar question. A couple of guys exchanged glances, then looked back at us before one finally said, "Camping is lame," and walked out. Another fellow acted like our presence was a bother, but he reluctantly pointed us in the direction of a campground about 3 miles outside of town. Well, it turned out to be 17 miles away and closed for the season. Aside from these encounters, the cyclists we met along the way also had their fair share of attitudes. Some of them seemed to think that our lack of training for this tour was foolish and didn't hesitate to tell us so. I remember one guy asking about my saddle and then berating me for choosing a Brooks saddle without breaking it in ahead of time. I retorted with, "It's getting broken in on this tour, isn't it?" While we certainly encountered a few snarky individuals, it wasn't all bad. Ashland, VA, stood out as an exception. Every person we met there was incredibly friendly. Some local residents even offered us their homes to stay in, and they invited us to return during the summer to hang out. Different folks we met that day asked if they could join us for a few miles as we rode north, just to chat and enjoy the journey. It was heartening to see how their attitudes contrasted with those of some solo or double cyclists we had crossed paths with during the trip. Not everyone may be as warm and welcoming, but the kindness of people like those in Ashland more than makes up for it. In the end, we learned to ignore the negativity and focus on the positive connections we made along the way. My current bike is my first ever road bike, and I've had it for around 2 months now. For the majority of that time, I used flat pedals. However, just 3 days ago, I decided to take the plunge and bought myself some cycling shoes and SPD diesel pedals to clip into. On the first day with my new setup, I went for a short 10 kilometers ride, and everything went smoothly. I really enjoyed the feeling of being securely locked into the bike. As dusk settled in, I put my bike to rest for the night. The following morning, I was eager to get back on the road. Before I could set off, I needed to make a few adjustments. I tweaked the seat height slightly, tightened the pedal engagement just a bit, put on my cycling shoes, and took the bike for a quick spin to the end of the driveway. I turned around and pedaled back to the garage. As I neared the end, I decided to test the brakes to feel the stopping power of my sweet disc brakes. However, as I came to a quick stop, I unexpectedly tumbled over while still securely attached to the pedals, scraping some skin off my knee against the concrete. But hold on, there's more to this story. Apparently, I'm a slow learner. Today, I embarked on a longer ride, covering a distance of 47 kilometers. By the time I had completed about 35 kilometers, I thought I was really getting the hang of these clipless pedals. My confidence was riding high. I found myself riding slowly behind cars as I approached a roundabout, hoping to avoid having to unclip from the pedals. The cars were gradually slowing down, and so was I. Until, once again, I unexpectedly fell over in the middle of the road, with my feet securely attached to the pedals, and cars waiting behind me. It was a lesson I hope I finally learned for good.